and welcome to another episode of Second Gen's Liberated Panda. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest. His name is Drew Thompson.
And for more on this story, we have with us Drew Thompson from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So it seems like both sides are downplaying expectations ahead of the meeting.
Absolutely. I think both sides have signaled very clearly that they're going in to exchange views. The concern is that they're really just going to exchange laundry lists of complaints about the other. Both sides have dug in pretty hard to the point where both Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi have given speeches in advance of this summit, saying basically that the fault of the relationship, the troubles in the relationship are fully on the U.S. side and partly a legacy of the Trump administration. So that doesn't give the Biden administration much room to take care of any of these challenges. What they are doing is they're going through a process of reviewing existing policies, existing actions that were taken under the Trump administration to decide which to keep, which to modify, and then moderate their China relationship accordingly. But the U.S. side has also very, very carefully managed expectations by stating that this is not a dialogue. It's not going to repeat unless there are some concrete outcomes, which is what the U.S. would call a results-oriented meeting. So if something constructive happens, then we'll see another meeting. If not, then they'll both return to their respective corners and take it from there.
Thompson. Hi, Drew. How are you?
Hi, Angel. I'm fine, thank you.
So I'm going to let Drew introduce himself and tell our audience all about his background, how he got into the Department of Defense, what motivated him to join the China department, and what he's doing now, and all that good stuff. So, Drew, please, would you introduce yourself to our audience?
Certainly. Well, I've spent most of my career focused on Asia generally and China specifically. I made my first visit to China in 1990 as a student at Beijing University. And then I studied as an undergraduate, and then I studied for 1 year at the Hopkins Nanjing Center, which is a joint venture between Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington and Nanjing University. And it was the first joint venture program with both international and Chinese students living and studying together. So I did that in 1992, and then I spent the next several years working in China in a variety of companies. And then I moved to Washington, D.C. in the late 90s and started working in think tanks, working on policy issues and analyzing Chinese decision-making and government structures. So I did that for several years and eventually joined the Department of Defense as the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And I did that from 2011 to 2018. And I was responsible for engagement with the militaries of China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and also for coordinating within the Department of Defense and within the interagency, primarily the State Department and the White House, to help develop and formulate China strategy and policy. And then in 2018, I moved to Singapore with my family. And I joined the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. And I now teach graduate students in two classes, one on U.S.-China relations and one on political risk analysis.
Wow, so that is quite a resume. You've led quite a life. And it sounds like you've had a lot of experience dealing with U.S.-China relations when you were in the Department of Defense. So in connection with that, I'd like to ask you, how do you see the conflict resolving in the South China Sea with respect to China's frequent boundary aggression?
Well, I think China has made it clear that it claims everything within the 9-dash line. And while that claim isn't particularly clear, and the United States and other claimants have asked China to clarify that claim and make it consistent with international law, it's failed to do so. So the biggest challenge is that China is really unwilling to recognize others' overlapping claims, and it's therefore unwilling to compromise on its own claim. And it's also, I think, unwilling to negotiate in good faith towards a compromise solution with the other claimant states. And it's important to remember the U.S. is not a claimant state here. The U.S.'s primary interest is in peaceful resolution of disputes and strengthening of international law that grants the U.S. Access and freedom of operation and freedom of navigation through the South China Sea. So I think the prospects for a quick resolution of the South China Sea dispute is highly unlikely. Talks with ASEAN over a code of conduct have pretty much stalled, and presumably that's over irreconcilable differences. But that's also partly because China has really trampled all over the 2002 Declaration of the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, which was a fairly brief interim agreement that calls on all the parties to resolve their differences peacefully and to respect certain norms. And China really hasn't done that. It's conducted a massive reclamation campaign to build islands out of what were essentially reefs and submerged low tide features. And they have reclaimed over 3,200 square acres of land from where it didn't exist prior. And that's about 20 times more than any other country has, or any or all of the other countries have reclaimed combined. So really what China has done just far outstrips what any other country has done. And by and large, I think has put so much pressure on these other countries through things like deploying its maritime militia fleets to occupy features. They've been running survey vessels through other countries' EEZs, which is not consistent with international law. And then there have been several incidents, such as the sinking of Vietnamese and Philippine fishing vessels by Chinese ships. So I think the South China Sea disputes are not going to resolve anytime soon, and there really isn't a viable pathway towards resolution that I can see.
Oh, okay, well, that's disappointing. So what about, how do you see the conflict resolving between China and Taiwan? I would assume that it's kind of similar to the situation in the South China Sea, but I will let you, the expert, give us the analysis on that.
Well, I mean, like the South China Sea, it's very difficult to see a peaceful resolution at this point. I think at best, all we can hope for is continued détente between China and Taiwan. Unfortunately, there's very serious tensions in the cross-strait relationship that show no signs of abating. I think the biggest underlying factor is that Chinese and Taiwanese societies are increasingly separate and they're diverging, particularly under Xi Jinping. So it's not just about Taiwan self-identification. There have been extensive polling to determine how Taiwanese see themselves. Do they self-identify as Chinese, as Taiwanese, or as both? And increasingly, especially amongst younger people, they self-identify as Taiwanese rather than Chinese. So you've got not only these diverging self-identities, you also have very diverging societal norms, particularly around their political system. Taiwan's democracy is very robust. Their societal freedoms really make federation with China unpalatable for the people of Taiwan. So I think Beijing's failure to maintain the freedoms granted to the people of Hong Kong under the Basic Law for 50 years, under the one country, two systems framework, really makes federation with China incredibly unpalatable for Taiwanese. And that includes the Kuomintang, the KMT, who, while being supportive of a one China principle and hoping for a future reunification at some point, they've completely rejected one country, two systems as a framework. So the people of Taiwan have no desire to join politically with China, and particularly with a China that's essentially an authoritarian system where it's inevitable that the Taiwanese people would lose their political rights. So if you have a Taiwan that's not willing to voluntarily unify with China, that essentially leaves Beijing with I would say, maybe three options. They can continue to wait passively for conditions to change. They could increase pressure on Taiwan through coercion, or they could compel the unification through force. And I think, obviously, most people would prefer the status quo and continuing the degree of détente that exists now, and just wait for better circumstances for unification to occur that's satisfactory to people on both sides. But those trend lines aren't pointing in that direction. So the question is, how much pressure will China put on Taiwan above and beyond what they're already doing, or whether Xi Jinping will determine that now's the time to use military force to compel unification. And we don't know when that will be.
Okay, so it sounds like a very complicated situation, definitely. So what stance would America likely take? That's an understatement, but what stance would America likely take, or what would Americans likely do if China does decide to take back Taiwan by force, let's just say?
So, I mean, there's really only one person who can answer that question, and that's the US president. I mean, that's a question that will be put to him or her. And that's known as a tier 0 decision in national security decision processes. So it's one that only the president can make. But it's worth analyzing, of course. I mean, the US has pretty significant interests in Taiwan. They want to maintain a status quo that includes a free, open, democratic Taiwan. And I think if you think about how some countries feel that trade constrains their foreign policy choices as it comes to China, because it's such a large trading partner, it's worth noting that Taiwan is the US's 10th largest trading partner, and it's a major part of US supply chains, particularly for ICT goods, for integrated circuits, computers, high technology. So it's vitally important to the U.S. economy. It's also an important, people-to-people relationship between the two countries. I mean, I've seen estimates that the Taiwan diaspora population in the United States ranges anywhere from between 500,000 to 900,000 people, and that's not a small constituency. So I mean, this is not an abstract issue for the United States. It has significant interests in Taiwan. So I've always presumed that a U.S. president would come to Taiwan's defense in the event that it would come under attack from China. And I think there's a couple things that would really compel a U.S. president to do that. The first is, of course, Congress would demand it. The president's legacy would also ride on the decision. So that's a second factor. But I think the most compelling factor is that U.S. credibility with all of its allies would be completely at stake in a Taiwan scenario. So not committing to come to Taiwan's defense or abandoning Taiwan would essentially mean the end of the alliance structure in Asia as we know it. So in that respect, I think the president really may take time to make that decision, but ultimately when they weigh the risks against the necessity of and the interests at stake, that the president will ultimately conclude that they must come to Taiwan's defense.
Yes, I actually have the same thought as well. We must protect Taiwan, especially to keep the stability over there in that part of the hemisphere. So I completely agree with your analysis. So what are your thoughts about strategic ambiguity? And for those in our audience that don't know what strategic ambiguity is, maybe you can kind of explain that first. And do you think America is better off discarding or keeping this policy?
Certainly. So strategic ambiguity is essentially the U.S. posture towards Taiwan. So unlike a traditional ally where the U.S. would have a mutual defense treaty with that ally, which basically requires the U.S. And that ally to come to each other's defense, that doesn't exist with Taiwan. The strongest binding document between the two is the Taiwan Relations Act, which requires the United States to provide arms of a defensive character to Taiwan, and also for the U.S. itself to maintain the ability to defend Taiwan. But it stops short of requiring the United States to come to Taiwan's defense. So that element of assurance is lacking in the U.S. posture. And U.S. policy statements have also been somewhat vague about whether or not the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense. And that's known as strategic ambiguity. The U.S. has an obligation to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself, but it doesn't necessarily commit to actually coming to their defense. So that strategic ambiguity has been in existence since the U.S.-Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty, which was signed in 1954, was abrogated when the U.S. changed its recognition to China in 1979. So since then, the Taiwan Relations Act has really defined how the U.S. Provides for Taiwan's security. So that strategic ambiguity has lasted and effectively maintained cross-strait stability since 1979. So I think ultimately it's necessary to keep it. And the first reason is because, as I said, it works. It's detained Beijing so far, and it continues to do so. I think the second big reason is that by removing it, you'd be giving Taiwan unconditional assurances that would create a moral hazard for Taiwan politicians. There may be some particularly DPP politicians who might be badly tempted to antagonize Beijing in order to win votes from deep green pro-independence political supporters without taking into consideration what U.S. interests would be. And remember, it is still the U.S. that essentially underwrites Taiwan's sovereignty. So giving up strategic ambiguity would probably create the very conditions that the U.S. would want to avoid. It would incentivize Taiwanese politicians to antagonize Beijing, and then an antagonized Beijing would be convinced that Taiwan is moving towards independence, which they would feel then forces their hand to use whatever means are necessary to prevent that independence, and that could include the use of force. So I think giving Taiwan overly concrete assurances might make them feel better, but I don't see how it would contribute to enabling cross-strait dialogue, cross-strait stability, or ultimately peaceful resolution.
I see. So you're of the opinion that keeping this strategic ambiguity is the best way to go to avoid further conflict.
Absolutely. I think the U.S. would have much to lose and probably little to gain by giving Taiwan the overly concrete assurances that might lead them into direct conflict with Taiwan. And likewise, as I previously stated, going the opposite direction and removing any assurances for Taiwan would also be a mistake, such as getting rid of the Taiwan Relations Act or not committing to Taiwan's defense in any way, because that would, of course, embolden Beijing to use force to unify Taiwan. And of course, it would destroy U.S. credibility with the rest of its allies.
So to me, it almost seems like there's like a parallel to the Taiwan issue and North Korea and the ceasefire with South Korea and how that's been going on for decades, and it's a ceasefire, but that has kept the peace. Do you see it going that way?
So, I think for all of the U.S.'s alliance relationships, whether it's with South Korea, Japan, European allies, the United States has to create a very careful balance of reassurance. And of course, allies tend to demand assurances. They tend to demand reassurance, whether that's extended deterrence in the case of, say, South Korea, and the explicit policy that the U.S. will use all means necessary to defend South Korea, including and up to nuclear in the event that North Korea uses its nuclear devices. So extended deterrence is sort of the far end of that spectrum and necessary in certain circumstances. But in other cases, the U.S. needs to balance that need to reassure allies at the same time, create the conditions for stability so that those countries that are threatening a U.S. ally don't feel either threatened or emboldened themselves. So engaging with those competing nations that threaten our allies is another important part of the equation. It includes both deterring them, using threats, credible threats, threats of retaliation, threats of punishment, but also assurances for those competitors to ensure that they realize that there are benefits to maintaining stability in the status quo. So I think the U.S. is constantly, in all parts of the globe, balancing these relationships between its allies, which it seeks to reassure, and those competing countries that threaten to destabilize whatever region they're in, and threaten the allies that the U.S. are trying to protect. So it's a constant balancing act, and I think the U.S. has done quite well, particularly in Northeast Asia, in maintaining that balance, particularly in the face of China's rise and its growing defense capabilities.
That's interesting, because sometimes you hear that when U.S. goes and they interfere with other countries, sometimes it doesn't produce good results. So that was actually going to be my next question: is what do you think U.S. is having good results in that area of the world? And your answer is yes. You think they're doing a pretty good job over there, right?
Well, I mean, it's something of a, it's in vogue to criticize the United States constantly.
Yes.
But at the same time, most countries that are quick to criticize them also, seek to have, either good relationships or assurances from them at the same time. So again, I think that's one of the strengths of the U.S. political culture and system, is that it's open to criticism, it's open to critique, it's an open debating society. So from that perspective, I think there's lots of complaints, but really the international system that the U.S. has stood up and underwritten since the end of World War II has by and large benefited the people of Asia quite well over the last call it 70 years. So I think there's a lot of support for U.S. presence, U.S. active diplomacy, and U.S. investment in particularly in Asia. And while there may be criticism, I think the door is much more open than it is closed.
So switching gears a little bit from diplomacy to hot war, how ambitious do we think the PLA defense budget numbers are under Xi Jinping?
So, I mean, there's a couple ways to look at the development of the PLA. You can quibble about the statistics, but what's undeniable is for the last 20 plus years, the PLA has enjoyed sustained annual increases in its budget, averaging around 10% per year. And while that percentage number has gone down recently in the last 5 years, in real terms, the actual real term amount that it's been receiving in terms of annual increases is quite significant. But the real challenge, of course, is the lack of transparency into China's budget and defense spending, which is why there's pretty significant discrepancies between the budgets, defense budgets that China announces and what NGOs and the U.S. intelligence community think it is. So China's announced defense budget in 2020 was about 178 billion US dollars. And in March, they announced that it will increase to $209 billion in 2021, which is almost a 7% increase. So even though the percent of increase has declined, we're still talking about massive increases in defense spending that in some cases could be far outstripping or equaling. In other words, the annual increase in China's defense spending is larger than most other countries spend per year. So its growth is really quite significant. But that discrepancy between what China announces and what we think it actually is due to a number of factors. And it's largely how China accounts for its defense spending. So, for example, China doesn't include in its announced defense spending things like the People's Armed Police, which are under the command of the Central Military Commission, or the Coast Guard, or their space program, or their foreign weapons procurement, which comes from a different budget. And of course, I don't think that many parts of the research and development budget, including aspects of the military civil fusion program, are included. So there's large aspects of China's government spending that go towards its defense that are not included in its defense budget. And just to give an example, for the 2019 figure, the announced budget was, as I said, 178 billion. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimated that China's defense spending that year was 240 billion. So you're talking over, $60 billion, about $60 billion difference, and that's 40% difference in the estimate and the reported figures. And that was corroborated, I think, by the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. They also put their estimate of defense spending at over $230 billion. So the discrepancy between what those NGOs, the U.S. Department of Defense, the intelligence community estimate is a pretty significant gap. But as I said, I think that's almost an accounting issue. It's worth noting that the amount of China's increases are massive compared to the spending of other countries around it. So just by comparison, Taiwan's military spending is approximately $10 to $11 billion a year. So just the increase in China's defense spending can be 2 to 3 times Taiwan's total budget.
Wow.
So I mean, the growth of China's defense spending is really unprecedented, and it really compares to nothing else in the region. Now, the U.S., on the other hand, the U.S. spends about $720 billion a year, give or take, on defense spending. So it far outstrips China's $200 billion. But one has to remember the U.S. spends that globally. Has presence in Europe, Middle East, as well as in Asia. So they're really not they're really not comparable. And it's also worth noting that much of what China spends is focused on unification of Taiwan.
Right. So that's very interesting, and I guess it's interesting that they don't include all the numbers that we would include in there. So it's a different way, like you said, it's a different way of accounting for things. So it seems like, if I'm hearing you correctly, China is underreporting how much their PLA budget is compared to what we're finding out.
Yeah, I mean, I think U.S. European organizations can estimate what they think China's total spending is compared to what their declared spending is.
I'm not surprised.
But it's in an order of about 40% gap between our estimates and reporting. But as I pointed out, comparisons are difficult to make when it comes to how China spends its money, what it spends it towards, and how other militaries are postured.
So what is the relative strength of Chinese military under Xi Jinping compared to U.S. and I guess other countries as well, but more importantly, the U.S.?
So it's very difficult to compare the two militaries because they are so fundamentally different. And as I mentioned, China primarily operates on its own periphery, with a few exceptions. It generally is postured and prepared and structured to fight close to home, whereas the U.S. is postured to fight globally, not at home. So in some ways they're very different. One also has to remember the major political differences. The People's Liberation Army is fundamentally different than the U.S. military. The PLA is the armed wing of the Communist Party. And their primary mission is to defend the party, while the U.S. military is sworn to defend the country and the Constitution. So their basic principle is very different. And that helps explain why the U.S. seeks to defend itself abroad, and the PLA seeks to defend the party, which operates primarily at home. So from that perspective, they're quite different. Their strengths are also very difficult to measure, and that's partly a function of the way we perceive modern warfare. It's not about symmetrical matchups. It's difficult to say, well, China has this number of ships and the U.S. has this number of ships in the Pacific theater, for example. Partly because if there were a conflict, the U.S. would be bringing forces from other parts of the globe, so those numbers would accordion. They would change, they would grow and shrink as a conflict develops. While at the same time, you also have aspects that are very difficult to compare, and capabilities that are absolutely crucial to a conflict that are difficult to measure. I mean, how do you measure capabilities in space? How do you measure capabilities in cyber? How do you measure, for instance, all of the capabilities that are assigned to, in the PLA's case, the Strategic Support Force? So in that respect, you've got really the sort of the nuances of the two that really defy comparison. And likewise, the U.S. has been engaged in various forms of warfare and combat since 2001, in giving the U.S. military a specific type of experiences that potentially give it an advantage, though it's unclear if those advantages that the U.S. has would apply, and those experiences the U.S. have would apply to a conflict with China, which would be a very different type of conflict than what the U.S. is engaged in. So I think there's enough unknowns here that I'm not comfortable making a prediction how the two militaries would match up.